It started in response to Fort Ferguson. We stand in solidarity with that movement. And I want to welcome you to Is Justice Blind? You can clap for that. I'm glad everybody's here. Our public forum. First up, we're going to have some remarks from my fellow Hartford Action member, Patricia Flowers. So I'm going to welcome her. If you all could clap for Patricia as she comes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome, as my Hartford Action Team member, Derek Hall, has welcomed you. My task is to, you see on the program, is to bring a spoken word. That's what my team members refer to it as. For me, it's a statement of occasion. And so, I just want to, can you put this in here for me?
Yeah, sure can.
I can't hold and talk at the same time. It's a statement of occasion for this very important event. A few panelists that were invited to this event reminded me, or assured me, or told me that this Justice is Blind event is a very important event. And so I stand to give a statement for the occasion. When Baltimore's State Attorney Marilyn Mosby announced charges against 6 Baltimore City police officers for their alleged role in the death of Freddie Gray, many voices rebutted that it was a rush to judgment. Some said that she rushed to judgment to quell the uprising of the community who felt ignored by a system sworn to protect them, yet whom they believed prey upon them instead. What amazed me about these dissenting voices was that in the midst of a community's grief over yet another young black man's homicide at the hands of law enforcement, the lack of an aha moment, that a rush to judgment is a man of color's everyday reality. A reality that often gets ignored in the absence of protests and uprisings, and now recordings. Today, I found myself at 450 Main Street in Hartford, Connecticut. Some of you know where that is. It's the U.S. Federal Courthouse. I would say that I was not there by an appointment, but maybe I was. I was looking for a program that I thought was housed there, but it wasn't. But circumstance had it that I ended up spending over an hour talking to a probation officer who did not know me, and I did not know her. And she's here this evening, Sister Benita. We talked about many things, but the highlight of the conversation for me, at least for this particular event, for this statement of occasion, was how she shared how she tries to counsel her clients who are on probation or parole not to bring suspicious attention to themselves by the way they dress with their loud music and tinted windows and so forth, so that this would reduce the number of traffic stops they endure on a regular basis. Now, it took everything in my power to sit there and listen, knowing that I would be attending this event tonight to discuss the outcome of a report on a law that has been broken over and over again in the past 15 years without accountability. And to tell her that this law was enacted because of the racial profiling of a reputable black man, a Connecticut State Senator, Alvin W. Penn, who I presume had his pants pulled up, had legally tinted windows, and probably was not playing loud music in his car. Yet still, there was a rush to judgment on why a black man would be driving through Trumbull, Connecticut in the spring of 1996. As I was reviewing the history of the implementation of the Alvin W. Penn Racial Profiling Prohibition Act, I was taken aback by the length of time and the circumstances that led up to the actual enforcement of this law. Almost 15 years. And I asked myself, how many times has this law been violated in these 15 years without accountability? And how many constitutional rights have been trampled upon since the violation of this act? How many arrests, often mass and pretextual arrests, and then justified by police departments' internal investigations, have taken place in the last 15 years because this law was enacted, but it was not enforced. There does not seem to be a rush to judgment there. But yet there continues to be a rush to judgment on men of color, whose visibility is dark enough to thrust them into the limelight of suspicion, in spite of the enactment of the law. 15 years. A lot has happened in 15 years that the Racial Profile and Prohibition Act has been acted, but not enforced. A lot has happened. The target population for racial profiling has grown over the course of these 15 years. There is now an Arab population, a Muslim population, an Indian population, a Native American population, and an immigrant population whose profiling status has not been included in this Connecticut RP3 report. Which begs the question, is this report a rush to judgment on racial profiling in Connecticut? Has it been judged correctly? It begs the question, is this report commissioned only to quell an uprising in East Haven Latino community? It begs the question, must we wait for another uprising, another 15 years, or even another year for a full report on those left out of the scope of this analysis? Or, panelists, is this the beginning of the end of a rush to judgment on all people of color, all nationalities, all ethnic groups, all social classes, all religious affiliations, all sexual orientation persuasions? It begs the question. In the words of Benjamin Todd, former president and chief executive officer of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they're still strong. Named as one of the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders by the Washington Post, he says, racial profiling punishes innocent individuals for the past actions of those who look and sound like them. It misdirects crucial resources and undercuts the trust needed between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. It has no place in our national discourse and no place in our nation's police departments. Racial profiling is a rush to judgment.
Thank you, Patricia. Next up, we have Earl Bloodworth, who has some words for us this evening. Earl.
I'm Earl Bloodworth. I'm from the African American Affairs Commission down at the state capitol. We are a nonpartisan commission, and I'm the information officer, so it's kind of my job to get out into the field and also to try to put events like this together and get really talented people to come out and speak, and then also get really interested people to come out and listen. This particular event was put on by myself and Hartford Action and the CREC, which is the Latin and Puerto Rican commission as well, down at the Capitol. We work hand in hand and try to do a lot of things to get our people involved and engaged. Not sure I can quite follow Ms. Patricia Flowers, but we just want to, again, thank you all for coming out. This is a really important report that was generated by the state of Connecticut, and it behooves everyone to get involved and listen, not just to the report, because the impetus for getting you guys here was around the reporting for racial profiling, but the overall arching issues that we face as a state and as a population of Black and brown people and as a nation is huge, and we need to really understand what we're facing so we can then attack it and come up with some solutions together. And that's one of the reasons why we have these people here to discuss possible solutions to the issues that we have. We have chief of police here, we have researchers here, we have the executive director from CHRO here, we have the executive director of Connecticut ACLU here. So we have a wealth of people, and this is just a second forum in the series. The first one was held in New Haven. We'll be holding some more, Waterbury, Norwich, Bridgeport, tentatively scheduled for June 9th. So again, if you can't make that one, make sure you let somebody else know in your packet. You have voter registration cards. You know somebody that's not registered to vote. Let them get registered to vote, because that's the only way we're going to have some progress in making a change. You have to be civically engaged. If we're not civically engaged and we're just protesting and yelling, we're not going to move the mark, and it's just going to keep happening again on a cycle. And then, as Patricia said, people rush into judgment with anger and emotion and no passion for solutions. We need more passion for solutions. And again, thank you all for coming.
Excellent. I'm going to be your MC for today, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. Let's get started. Just raise your hand if you've heard of this racial profiling report before. Raise your hand if you've heard of it before. Okay, so quite a few hands in this room. Excellent. In this public forum, we're going to seek to understand that even better. And to help us with that, we have Ken Barone. So I'm going to invite him up to the podium now. He's going to tell us a little bit about, for maybe those of us who haven't had a chance to see this report, a little bit about what it is and maybe some ways to think about it. So I welcome Ken.
Thank you for inviting me. Again, my name is Ken Barone. I'm with Central Connecticut State University. I have been given approximately 10 minutes to try and talk to you a little bit about what we do and the report that recently came out. I don't have a clock up here, so what I'm going to do, because sometimes I end up, kind of somewhere where I didn't anticipate, is just ask Earl to give me a good sign when I'm around 10 minutes so I know when to be quiet and sit down. Yeah. Thanks, Earl. So, a little history. I'm not going to go back as far as when the Alvin Penn Act was initially enacted in 1999. I think that was covered by Patricia pretty well. But as many of you in this room know, in 2012, the FBI arrested several officers in East Haven on civil rights violations, particularly against Latino individuals by that department. As a result of that, the legislature and the public said, well, there's this law in the books, what's going on? And it was determined that only 27 out of 106 police agencies were properly collecting and submitting the information that was required by law to the state. Furthermore, not much was being done with that information due to a variety of issues, but primarily a lack of resources and a lack of having that information in some sort of a central database so something meaningful could be done with it. So under the leadership of this governor, Dan Malloy, and the legislature, they revamped. They went back to the table and they figured out how can we strengthen this law and how can we make it something meaningful. They also secured some money from the federal government to help implement the changes that the legislature was about to make. It's important to note when the legislature went back to rewrite the Alvin Penn Act, to make it a stronger bill, to make it a bill that would provide us with something meaningful in Connecticut, this was not a partisan issue. It passed unanimously in both houses and was signed by the governor. So this isn't a Democrat and a Republican issue. Everybody in our state legislature got together and said this is an important thing to do. As a result of that, through the governor's office and the Office of Policy and Management, our university was tasked with implementing the law. And that's the task that we've undertaken now for the better part of almost 3 years. The first thing we did was put together an advisory board. So we've got to bring together all the invested parties in making sure that when we implement a law this time around, it works and it gives us something that we could use. We brought law enforcement to the table. We brought advocacy groups to the table, many of which are here, the African American Affairs Commission, the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission, the Asian Pacific Islander Commission, Tanya Hughes and CHRO, the ACLU, all joined forces to work through the complexities of how you address police profiling, okay? The reason why we spend so much time focusing on traffic stops is because traffic stops are the most common encounter that people in the public will generally have with law enforcement. There were approximately 650,000 traffic stops conducted in the state of Connecticut last year, okay? And so for most people, it is the entree into having contact with law enforcement. So it was important to look at that to try and understand if racial disparities exist, and if they exist, why they exist, okay? For too long, this conversation has operated based on anecdotes and perception. And we took the task of trying to move the conversation beyond just anecdotes and to provide good information that could inform both the public and law enforcement to hopefully start to move the needle on this issue. So the law went into effect on October 1, 2013, and we began collecting all of this information on everybody who is stopped in the state of Connecticut by law enforcement. And then we decided to take the task of figuring out, now that we have this good information, how do we analyze this information so that it's a useful tool for the public? And we looked around the country. We said, let's not reinvent the wheel. There are about 25 other states besides Connecticut that collect information on traffic stops and make some attempt to analyze it to better understand if racial profiling is occurring in their states. Most states and most jurisdictions that do it take data for a certain amount of time, usually the course of a year or two, and they compare that information to one indicator, typically resident census data. So they would, for instance, look at who was pulled over in Hartford over the course of a year, and they would look at who lives in Hartford, and then they would try and draw some conclusions. And there's a lot of issues with that, right? When we started sitting down and really thinking about this, we said, well, there's, not everybody who lives in a community drives. Some people take public transportation. You've got people coming into towns for employment, for recreation, for a variety of other reasons. So we want to do better than what some of those other states have done. So other states either compare data to one indicator, or they just put the data out there and said, have at it, everybody, draw your own conclusions. That's not helpful. That's not helpful because all it does when you just put information out there and don't provide context to it is it doesn't frame the conversation, and it doesn't really allow, in particular, law enforcement to understand how to better use that information to make better data-driven decisions, okay? And so what we attempted to do in developing this report was to analyze the first 12 months of information and to provide the state with a comprehensive analysis. And what we did was we did not compare information to one indicator. We didn't just put information out there for the public to consume. We took 7 different measures, 7 different ways to look at the information, and then we identified those communities that had the largest and most consistent disparities, okay? Which is something that's never been done across the country. And our thought process was that if you're an agency that was identified as having a disparity, right, when pulling over minorities compared to one indicator, you might be able to explain that for a variety of reasons, right? And it might not mean that much. But when you take 7 indicators and you start to see some of the same agencies identified in each of those indicators, a reasonable person starts to look at that information and say, I think it's time that we take a deeper look. So we were tasked with looking at, in particular, 102 police agencies, okay? So we didn't have the ability, when you're dealing with that many police departments and that much information, to drill down real deep into the data in terms of looking at differences across officers, looking at mapping the data to understand differences in neighborhood trends, right? So we designed a system that would screen departments to identify the biggest outliers that we would then put through a further analysis. That's what this report does. So this report identifies the 10 municipal police agencies and the 2 state police troops barracks that were the largest outliers in the state of Connecticut, who had statistically significant racial or ethnic disparities. And we have now undertaken the task of working with those agencies to look further at what's driving those disparities. Okay? And I've traveled the state now for the better part of 4 weeks, meeting with 3 or 4 different police departments every week, and we've had some really interesting conversations, and some really good conversations about what the information means, what it means for people in their community, and how they can try and eliminate potential bias for that could potentially be driving the numbers in that particular community. So just so that we all know what we're talking about here, the communities that we identified as having statistically significant racial and ethnic disparities were the town of Granby, Groton Town. Groton's really weird. They've got Groton City, Groton Town, Groton Long Point, Groton Town, Waterbury, Troop C, which is up in Tolland, Troop H here in Hartford, showed significant disparities. Some of the municipal agencies that were also identified were Wethersfield, Hamden, Manchester, New Britain, Stratford, and East Hartford. Okay, so these are all agencies that we've begun the task of trying to figure out how to further analyze the information to determine if it's a select group of officers that are driving the disparity, is it some sort of an enforcement decision that's going on that's driving a particular disparity. If we step back for a minute and we look 30,000-foot level, right, what the report also told us is that Black and Hispanic drivers are much more likely to be pulled over in the daylight than in darkness, when their race is less likely to be determined. Okay? And we also determined that there's a significant disparity, particularly amongst Hispanics being searched and contraband not being found. So one of the things we measure is search rates in a community, and if illegal contraband was found as a result of that search, and then you try and understand if a particular racial or ethnic group might be exposed to more searches unfairly. And what this report does do is it does tell us that in the state of Connecticut as a whole, Hispanics are much more likely to be searched and not have illegal contraband found, and Black and Hispanic individuals in particular are much more likely to be stopped than you would assume when measured against any one of the 7 indicators. That to me says that you know, the issue isn't here in Connecticut. The data tells me that at the very least, bias, unconscious bias in most cases, exists in many communities in this state, and they're driving the statewide trends, and that's something that we're now working to address. We are fortunate enough in the state of Connecticut to be supported by the Department of Justice in our effort. The Department of Justice has sponsored a fair and impartial policing training program where 10 individuals in the state of Connecticut are now certified Department of Justice trainers in fair and impartial policing. This is a program that works with recruits, line officers, and supervisors on dealing with the idea of unconscious bias and how that could affect the profession of law enforcement. We've begun those trainings. We have about 25 trainings that will be occurring around the state over the course of the next 6 months. So if nothing else, what this report did was it got law enforcement in a lot of communities to wake up and say, this is something that we're going to more aggressively address. It's got people talking. We're here today. We were in New Haven a few weeks ago. We've spoken to many police agencies. So I think, you know, I'm proud of the work we did. And this isn't a one-time report. The legislature has tasked us with doing this every year until they tell us to stop. And so this is the beginning of the conversation in Connecticut. And this is the beginning of using good information to improve the way law enforcement is done in the state of Connecticut. So, thank you.
Thank you. So it looks like some more people showed up, so I want to thank you all for coming as well and for taking that time. Community is, as you can imagine, everything to me. I think that our connection to each other, the way that we feel when we are in our homes, in our communities, and when we're on the roads is incredibly important. Here, we have a community of people. If we look around, we are from all different towns. We are from, raise your hand if you live in Connecticut. Raise your hand. Okay, sometimes we have out-of-towners. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you live right here in Hartford. Okay. Raise your hand if you live outside of Hartford. Absolutely. Okay, we are a community here gathered today. And we're a community in this space, right? So we have some panelists, and they're going to have some opportunities and some times to talk, for sure. But I also want to impress upon the audience that you have a role as well. So I'd like you to reach into that red bag that you have, and I'd like you to pull out these symbols. Now, Jason, if you could come around for me. Jason's going to hold up these signs for us. This is my good friend. Clap for Jason Fredlin. He is a Hartford Action member. And he's been super influential in bringing all this together, so I want to bring him up. And so you have these cards. So on these cards, you have agree. During this, what you hear from the panelists, okay, you are going to be able to put up an agree card if you agree with what they're saying, okay? So I might say something like, it's hot outside. If you agree with that today, you might put up a green card. Show me you can do that. Excellent. You got the gist of this thing, right? So then we have don't agree, okay? So if you hear something in the panel that you do not agree with, okay, as we go through things, you would put up the don't agree, okay? This is a nonverbal communication, not just to you, but also to the panelists, things that they can respond to. Okay? Now, if a panelist says something, which they might, that you absolutely cannot stand and that you think is very, very terrible and wrong, you can put up a block. Okay, the red symbol for a block, okay? And that's a way for you to, again, non-verbally communicate that you disagree with what is being said. Now, you can do this kind of organically, right? As we go through things, you can simply throw up whatever sign to let folks know how you feel. But there's also gonna be times where we're going to ask. I might ask a question to the audience. I'm gonna say a statement. It won't be a question, it'll be a statement. And you'll be able to say whether you agree, don't agree, or block that statement, and then that might lead into some conversation on the panel. Does that make sense? Are we excited about that? I am. So we will make that happen. Great. Jason, you did a great job. Thank you so much. So next up, let's think about these panelists. We have a great group gathered here. So we'll start with myself. I'm your moderator for the day. This is my living room. Not exactly, but that's how I'm going to treat it, okay? So we want spirited discussion, but we want to keep it civil, yes? And we also want to make sure that everyone gets kind of some talking time. So there's a lot of us here today, so we want you to keep your remarks to 2 to 3 minutes if you could. Now, I know it's going to be harder for some and easier for others. I will help you. That's what I'm here for. Okay, so what you might hear is you might hear me say time, which means that is all. But you're welcome to finish your statement. That's cool. You might hear me say half, like if something is going on and like you're at your halfway point, just to let you know where you're at. Does that make sense? That is a service. That's just for y'all, okay? So please, you might hear that. So next up we have Ken Barone over here. He is Policy and Research Specialist at the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy for Central Connecticut State University. I'm gonna go through all of them and then y'all can clap at the end because I know you're excited. Thank you so much. And then we have Yolanda Castillo. She is the Senior Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor for the State of Connecticut Department of Rehabilitation Services. Okay. We also have Steve Glassman. He is the Executive Director of American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Connecticut. We have Samaya Hernandez. She is with the Office of Policy, am I doing this right? Yeah, Office of Policy Management, Criminal Justice Division. We have Tanya Hughes. She's the Executive Director for the State of Connecticut Commission on Human Rights. We also have Brian Moran. He is partner Robinson & Cole LLP, founder of the Success Foundation Incorporated, and author of The Justice Imperative. We have I think we actually have a change. We had some changes, so I want to make sure I get this right. All right, we have Chief James Citron, okay, with the Weathersfield Police Department. We have Boulong Ramiz, who is the Assistant Director of Student Leadership at Wesleyan University. We also have Chief James Ravella, who is the Chief of Police for the Hartford Police Department. And last but certainly not least, a leader in the community, Bishop John Selders, who is the Senior Pastor at the Amistad UCC and Moral Monday. Did I miss anybody? We're all represented, we're all here. You can give them a round of applause for coming. Excellent. So I ran you through a little bit about, how the audience is going to participate, and as well as the panel. So we're good there. And now let's start this dialogue. Good. So for the panelists, your question is: does racial profiling exist in Connecticut? And I think we should begin with Chief James Ravella. Does racial profiling exist in Connecticut?
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
I would put it this way. When I came back in 2011 into the city, I had hoped not. I suspect so. Whether it's unconsciously or right out front, I suspect so. And I also want to say that if my public believes it, I have to address it. And I don't want to exceed my time, and I can talk later on some of the things we've taken to address it.
Excellent. Anyone else?
Yes, it exists. Absolutely. What's the red thing? And I'll say more later, too.
Any other thoughts on?
I guess I'd like to say that not only does racial profiling exist, but I think the debate that's going on in this country now about whether or not it exists is actually obfuscating the more important issue of how we address a long history and context of how we've gotten to this place where people of color, people of different ethnicities, different sexual orientations, whichever characteristic is being profiled, are now in the position where every aspect of their life is being profiled, whether you're walking down the street in the wrong neighborhood, whatever that means, if you're shopping, if you're waiting in line in an airport, if you're driving. But all aspects of your life are now being looked at and examined in the context of what your particular demographic has gone through historically in this country. So I don't know a single white person who has ever been profiled for their race. But every single person of color that I have talked to has been profiled multiple times every week of their life in one way or another. And depending on where you come from, you have a different life experience that instructs how you're going to react to this. If you haven't lived in a place where you have been profiled, you're less likely to believe that profiling still exists. If you're living in a neighborhood where you're constantly profiled, it's your experience and your relationship then with authorities is very different than it is in other neighborhoods.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, and just so that you all know, we want open and honest, spirited debate,
Okay.
so you don't have to look to me to give you permission
All
to
right, well,
speak at any time.
I don't want to speak out of turn.
Nope.
So I don't proclaim any expertise in this area. I did write a book on mass incarceration, but I have not focused on, not researched racial profiling. I did, however, look at this traffic report. And so I'm just speaking as a citizen, not as an expert. And I'm aware of the fact that blacks and Hispanics make up about 24% of the Connecticut population and about 66% of the inmates. But when I look at this report, I think the better question is not whether there is or isn't racial profiling, because everybody agrees that there is. What I'd be curious about is the people who are experts, having read this report, is what grade they would give the police, 15 years into this statute, outlawing it. Because I looked at the statistics, and from my perspective, that veil of darkness is a kind of a blind taste test kind of approach to it. So I think that demonstrates that there is some amount of profiling. But the numbers didn't strike me as being really out of whack. So I looked at it, just being a total novice, and I said, this isn't an F, this report. I think none of the police departments that I looked at Based on the statistics, I'd give them an F. I don't know that I'd give them an A, but I'd like to know from the people who have really drilled down and looked at this, based on this report, what grade would you give the state as a whole and the 10 sort of jurisdictions that were found to have been engaged in some amount of profiling?
Sure.
Yes, I think that question was directed to me, since I'm the only one here that had any actual writing. Let me just do one thing. He referenced something called the veil of darkness, and in 30 seconds, let me tell you what that is so you understand what we're talking about in case you haven't read the report. One of the tests that we ran on the data, and it's one of the tests that showed significant disparity on a statewide level as a whole, was you look at traffic stops that occur, so let's take, for example, 5 p.m. We all know that at sometimes throughout the year, 5 p.m. is light out, and at sometimes throughout the year, 5 p.m. is dark out, okay? So what you're looking is you look at all the traffic stops that occur between 5 and 5:15 p.m., sometimes when it's light out and sometimes when it's dark out, and after controlling for, right, anything possible that you can control for, there should theoretically be no difference between the number of black drivers, we'll say, stopped when it's more likely that you can tell their race or ethnicity during daylight, as opposed to in darkness, when it's much less likely that you can tell a driver's race because of darkness. So again, that's not what we never say is that you can always tell the motorist race during daylight and never tell during darkness. It's a hypothesis that says you're more likely to. And so essentially that's what you're measuring over the course of a variety of different time period where it could be light or dark out. And what we found is, again, that as a black and Hispanic driver, you are much more likely to be pulled over in daylight during the same time period as opposed to darkness. So that's when we refer to veil of darkness, that's what we say. And your question with regards to what letter grade, you know, I don't personally want to go down that path. I feel like that would get me into some trouble. You know, the report is clear. Disparities exist. If you're black and Hispanic, you are, you know, you're much more likely to be stopped, much more likely to be searched. And there are, although there are small disparities in almost every community, there are only a handful of communities that are really driving the statewide trend as a whole. So for whatever that's worth, we got work to do here. The difference between now and 15 years ago is we have the ability to pinpoint where we need to focus our time and attention on. We couldn't do that 15 years ago. We just didn't know, or we knew based on people said, I feel like this is happening here, or I feel like this is happening here. What we know now is, all right, we've got some particular areas that we want to focus our time and attention on. Then let's go back and measure this.
I'll go down that path because I'm not worried about trouble. So I think the issue that we have in Connecticut is that we like to get into this conversation of, well, we're not as bad as Ferguson, or we're not as bad as Baltimore, right? But I think we really need to move to a place that if there is one person in one city who is experiencing this, that's too much, right? That's an F, in my opinion. And so I think we really need to move beyond, well, we're in New England and we're progressive and we're a blue state and we have a Democratic mayor. You know, like whatever that is, that conversation is pointless because we're bad enough, right? Like we're bad enough where we need to really start addressing these issues in our state and from a place of understanding and accepting the fact that we do have a lot of work to do and we are not perfect. And so I think we need to move beyond that, accept the F, and get better.
Can I just say one thing about Ferguson? As a data person, right? When we were doing this, I piqued my own interest to go back and look at what Missouri was doing. Because believe it or not, Missouri is one of the states that does a really great job at collecting information about who police pull over. And for the last 10 years, the Attorney General in the state of Missouri has come out and said that there, in his words, in his report, there's a troubling disparity in the African-American stops and search rate in our state. Okay? And yet Ferguson still happened. let's just add that to the context of the conversation.
I feel there's, statement was made earlier about anecdotes and perceptions, that phrase, and I hear it a lot. I hear it a lot from folks that say, well, we're not, you're right, sis, we're not that bad. You know.
We know.
And we do know. And it's interesting to me that perceptions and anecdotes of some are used and valued, while perceptions and anecdotes of others are just hyperbole, or I heard another phrase that starts, that mashes on the button. It's emotional. You're doggone right I'm emotional. That's right. You're doggone right. Watched that young man in Ferguson. By the way, I'm from St. Louis. I was born in Kinloch, right next door to Ferguson. I've known Ferguson all my life. I know that city. And for at least 50 some odd years, that tells my age, happy birthday to me today. Happy birthday. That of individuals and families, family members who avoided driving in spaces like Ferguson or Velda Village, or for me here in Connecticut, Weathersfield. And you're here, Chief. So I'm putting you on indictment. Granby is another one. You slow down in Granby if you black and brown, because the likelihood for you to be pulled over. So for me, perceptions and anecdotes are solutional, because now we got data and we got people who do the data, and now we got numbers. I heard it from my family in St. Louis most recently. We need solutions. We're tired of the protests. Well, the 200+ days that every day since Mike Brown's death, people have protested, helped to put pressure on the community and, in fact, the United States to bring about the Justice Department's report in much the same way that happened in Hamden just a few years ago here in the state of Connecticut.
Let's have an audience check-in. If you believe, okay, I'm gonna say a statement, I want you to put up whether you agree, don't agree, or block, okay? The protests that we've seen nationally bring attention to, and it will eventually bring solutions to the problem of police brutality in this country. That is a two-part question. Take it or leave it, what do you want from me? So the first part is, do protests bring attention to? Yes. Will that attention bring solutions? Interesting. Okay. And while I have the audience's attention, I know that you all have questions, and I know that you have comments. There will be, what you have in your red bag is you have an index card. On this index card, we'd like you to jot down legibly questions, because we're going to take a small break, not now, but soon. We'll take a small break, and then we're going to actually go through those questions and have them asked to the panel, and then we're going to open it up for you all to ask questions as well. So that's how we'll do that, only for time. Great. But so please jot it down, keep it, and we'll definitely get to it. So I'm thinking about, as a moderator, from your unique perspectives, okay, what's the most important takeaway from the findings of the report? What do you think is most important? What does it tell you? And we can begin with the chief in Weathersfield.
I don't agree with the report. I think the numbers are skewed because of the way the report was done. I know Ken has explained that there were several benchmarks. But the fact is that the driving population, the EDP as they call it, was contrived from the population of the town and the workforce. There's a lot of other people that drive in Weathersfield, especially from the south and the Hartford. There are no supermarkets in the south and the Hartford or large clothing stores, so most people in the south and the Hartford drive into Weathersfield or maybe Newington to do their shopping. When you don't take that into account, then the numbers are skewed. And I'm sorry if you feel that you don't want to drive in Weathersfield, but I can promise you that the only vehicles that our officers stop are the ones who are violating the law.
Oh, no. I've experienced it firsthand. That would, my own personal experience would be.
I don't want to
That's.
get into an argument.
Tanya Hughes, you had a comment?
Then you should be complaining to me, because I don't want an officer who's going to be stopping someone for no reason at all. I don't. And I would weed that officer out if I had a complaint that that officer was doing it.
And I'm glad to hear you say that, Chief, because the opening remarks by Ms. Flowers said no rush to judgment. And when the report was issued, one of the most troubling things for me was that most of the police chiefs always say, that's not happening in my department. The numbers don't lie. The data is what it is. I do believe that we should not have a rush to judgment based on numbers alone, and that's where CHRO comes into play, because our job is to investigate the data based on all types of evidence, comparative data, statistical data, documentary data, testimonial data. Those are the things that will make us find out whether or not it's exactly racial profiling within the context of what is going on. But when we have chiefs that respond, it's not happening in my department, without any further inquiry, that's very troubling to me. And I think that's the problem with this discussion, is that there is already a rush to judgment before we even look into the data.
Can I ask Ken a question?
Please.
Did your study take into account why a stop was made, whether there was a specific violation, or whether the violation was sustained, and analyze the data from that standpoint?
So we looked at what we call post-stop data, right? The outcome of the stop, the reason for the stop. In particular, one of the things that's done across the country, again, when you do this, is you try and understand the level of discretion that an officer has in making certain types of stops, right? So often, let's put this out there. I've done this a couple times. There is no information, no data, anywhere in the entire United States of America that says that people of different racial or ethnic groups violate motor vehicle laws at different rates. None. Zero, zip, zilch. There's information that says younger drivers are slightly more reckless than older drivers, and that once you reach sometimes a certain age, you tend to get more accidents. That information exists. But in terms of differences across racial and ethnic groups, violating motor vehicle laws doesn't exist. In terms of answering your question, we looked at some of the reasons for the stop. We tried to understand. So for instance, maybe it's my own personal view and somebody could disagree, but somebody who blows through a stop sign, right? If I'm an officer, I'm probably going to stop that person because you're putting other people in danger, right? I mean, you could really, get in an accident. You could harm someone, right? So I would consider that a very low discretion, right? The officer most likely is going to stop someone who's speeding, going through a red light, going through a stop sign. Officers have much more discretion over making a decision to stop somebody for a display of plate violation, for instance. I had this conversation with the chief in Hampton. They seem to stop a majority of their residents for display of plate violations, right? Which is something's wrong with your license plate. Maybe something's obstructing it. Maybe it's in your back window as opposed to on your car, right? Things like that raise some flags and warrant further investigation. And so what we did in our report was we outlined the departments that we'd like to I said that backwards. We'd like to dig deeper into to better understand all of that. We have the information, it's good information, and for all the departments listed, we're going to do a much more in-depth analysis on that.
So I want to name that I'm not a numbers person. I don't do data. Not that person. So there is no such thing as unbiased policing, because there's no such thing as unbiased police, because police are human. And like every other human being on the planet, we have been socialized and conditioned to think of certain things about certain people. And that's just the reality of how we were born into this world, right? It takes a level of self-awareness to be able to check that and challenge it, right? And to be able to then operate from a framework of understanding that, yes, I've been socialized to think this about this group and this group and this group and this group, whether I learned that from my parents, from my grandparents, from my church, from the media, from magazines, whatever that may be, but being able to recognize that, because it exists in all of us, right? It's not just police, it's everybody. And knowing that we need to then operate from a place of being able to check ourselves and to be able to check each other and hold each other accountable. That's not to say that the police are doing this consciously, right? Or that they're operating from a place of hatred or operating from a place of wanting to punish people or reprimand people for their identities, right? But that's to say that as every other human being on this earth, we need to be able to accept that criticism, to hold each other accountable, to say, I have some self-work that I need to do. That takes some self-reflection, right? And if this is really going to be a community of care and a state of care, we need to be able to have that conversation and to recognize that and to hear people's experiences without being defensive, right? To hear, I hear what you're saying, I hear what you're experiencing, and
30 seconds.
I want to do better, and we can do better together. But it takes self-awareness. We have to all be able to look internally and do that work.
And may I add, Derek? I want to build on your point, which I think was beautifully expressed. I think when we start to look at solutions, possible solutions, one of the most important, and we've been advocating all throughout this legislative session for various bills which add cultural competency and unbiased policing training for every police force in Connecticut, because I think we don't come with any particular bias or stereotype about police. There are many, many good police, and there's some police who don't act as they should, and I don't think any police chief wants people who are violating the law in their police department. It makes them all look bad, and they all want police to be behaving properly. But I think the way you do that is by stepping back and acknowledging that you don't have a complete understanding of other people's cultures or histories or identities or traditions, and that you need instruction and you need some help in educating each of your officers as to other people's understandings of their relationships with police, of their way of functioning in society, and how we can improve the interactions between police in order to give everyone equal treatment as they engage in whatever activity, whether it's a promotional activity. You know, when I was growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in, which was clearly one that was more privileged, we were taught that police were our friends. We didn't fear the police. But in almost every community of color with which I'm engaged, people are feeling intimidated, frightened, suspicious, and they don't end up having the same kind of good feeling as they approach police that I did.
30 seconds.
And I think that's what we need to work on through training.
A quick check-in with our audience. To this statement, cultural competency training would improve police and community relations. Again, do you agree, not agree, or block? Cultural competency training would improve police and community relations. Okay, thank you. Some police officials have gone on record saying that this data is not prima facie evidence that racial profiling is occurring. What would unequivocal evidence of racial profiling look like?
Well, let me help you if nobody's going to speak up. In police work, we're driven by evidence-based this, evidence-based that. And then sometimes you have to go with what your gut says and where do you want to go and how do you want to get there. I would call this work, Ken, foundational. Foundational. I would look for it next year to see how it changes, where it goes, where it sprouts, before I say it is prima facie evidence that this is what's happening. And when we get back to training, I call it education. Education for our police officers, and I can't tell you how much I spend because the mayor is probably watching. Or when we talk about fair and impartial policing. Yes, that is in the police department today, in your police department. I actually gave it away to train the trainer for a lot of different departments around the state, because I think that's the beginning of change. It's the beginning of eye-opening. Foundational, but I need more, and I need more. We're in a self-regulation time now, folks, where officers, a light has gone off in officers' heads. Self-regulation. It's a great time. It's a great time for opportunity, and it's a silver lining for a police chief to make some changes, positive changes with his community and with his police department.
We haven't heard from some of the panelists, so I want to invite you all into the conversation as well.
I would like to say that for the first question that you asked, if there is racial profiling, yes, there is, and it's always been. But as time goes on, and we base it on this report now, that some departments are it's going on, but I really think that we have to remember police officers is a job. And we have very good police officers out there, and then we have police officers are not well, but it's all attitude and behavior. And I think as a solution, even though the training can happen, we also have to monitor it. This report is wonderful, but if we don't follow it and we don't make people accountable, it doesn't work. So we have to do the same when you train our officers, because there's wonderful people out there, and it has to be a community thing. Where community policing works wonderful if they're out there working with the community and knowing the people that are in that community. But it has to take a partnership. And I think the solutions here is to work together, no matter in what community, because we're all affected. And we want somebody to protect us, and that's what they're hired for. But we also have to make people accountable, and I think that is something that we don't do very well.
And I most certainly agree with the panelists. I do believe that racial profiling is a thing, just as racism is a thing. And I think that racial profiling is very much an extension of racism. And I think that it's something that we all share. I don't think it's a black or a white thing or a brown thing. And I do think that there's a conversation that the community needs to have, but there's a conversation that we each need to have that's much deeper than just policing.
And we need good mentors. And so I had the opportunity yesterday to conduct a training for 30 police supervisors from a variety of different departments around the state on this idea of bias and how it affects policing and how they're human. And a police supervisor told a story about how he was supervising a younger officer, and that he noticed after working with this officer for a little bit of time that the officer's demeanor, physical demeanor, changed pretty dramatically every time he pulled somebody over who was black. He'd kind of grab his belt a little bit, he'd puff out his chest a little bit, he spoke a little bit more authoritatively. And the supervisor told the story to say, this is a good cop, right? He's a good guy, I've known him for a while, his motives are good. But he changed the way that he approached that vehicle. And what this supervisor did was had a conversation with him. I said, do you know you're doing this? Are you aware that your body tenses up? And then what this supervisor did was, for a while, he said he modeled the type of behavior and the type of way that you should approach a car for everybody and the type of questions you should ask and the tone you should use. And they continued to have a conversation throughout the time that he was supervising this individual. Small little interactions like that, having supervisors that act as mentors and are good supervisors and are good mentors, that's really the way you're going to solve a lot of this, right? Is having somebody that you work with say, hey, I noticed you did that differently for that person who's black as opposed to the person who's white, or somebody who's a woman as opposed to somebody who's a man, right? I mean, everybody's out there looking for solutions. The solution is to be courageous enough to have that conversation with your colleague.
Do your police forces use cameras on both of you?
Not yet. Not yet.
Is that something you're in favor of?
Oh, in 2012, I brought cameras into the city on a trial basis, 40 cameras. I think they have a lot of benefit in law enforcement. We were kind of shut down. We have to go through some new union negotiations, and we're finally back to the table talking about a very, very huge investment into cameras. But cameras, body cameras,
Yeah,
Cruiser cameras,
yeah, both.
taser cameras, and the big project with with cameras around the city.
What's been your experience with it?
I love the cameras. Cameras are great. We have cameras in the cars and we have taser cameras. We don't have body cameras.
Is that something you're in favor of? Body cameras for each
Body
office?
cameras, I'm a little skeptical of because actually, to be honest with you, I have problems like with privacy. We're going into a lot of different places and a lot of different times, but a lot of different people. I don't think I'd really want, if it was my wife or my daughter or something, I don't know if I'd want that camera on that person coming into that location. And the same thing, the biggest fear that I have with body cameras is the officer has to go to the bathroom, let's say, and he's going to shut it off. Then he...
We're going to reserve our comments in the audience if we could. If we could, we want to keep it civil.
The fact that
But maybe a question based on that would be welcome.
and then forgets to turn it back on and something happens, it really looks bad. But the cameras that we have in the cars are excellent. We had a police shooting without the cameras several years ago, fatal police shooting, and we had a fatal police shooting with the cameras. And it made a world of a difference because it eliminated a lot of the doubt that would have been there without it.
So based on your having been tagged as one of these departments under this, within the statistics of potentially being biased, did you go back and look? I was curious whether you did any internal investigation, talked to your force, or went back and looked at any of the film from the cameras that you had relative to those stops to make some judgment about.
We do look at the cameras on a regular basis. If we get a complaint, we look, obviously, we check the cameras. And what the cameras have done a lot of is a lot of the trivial complaints that we used to get that just weren't true, because nobody likes getting a ticket, nobody likes getting stopped. So that eliminated a lot of those kind of complaints, and that freed up some of my staff time, to say the least. But no, I like the cameras. The cameras are twofold. I think Ken actually touched on this. The fact that the officer knows that he's being recorded, so he's probably a little bit nicer than he would have been without it. And the citizen knows that they're being recorded, and they maybe won't make up stories.
Yeah, well, you talked about accountability. I think the cameras is one way to have accountability.
Well, I'm not sure. I have mixed feelings about the cameras, because the cameras can be played with too. And so at the end of the day, how real are they? And somebody that's carrying a camera and something changes and the cop can have a chance, or anybody grab it and change what's there. I don't know. I just think I still have question about that. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do, but I'm still concerned about the cameras. You know, that's just my personal opinion. And so, you know, that's where I'm at with that. I mean, I think it's nice in the cars and whatever, but there's always ability to play with those things. And we just want people to feel that things are being done honestly and that they're doing their job, both the audience and the police officer, because, you know, we got to work as a community.
I assume the cameras have a date stamp, though.
Yes.
And
The cameras in the cars, I mean, I can explain it to you. The officer has no contact with the cameras in the cars.
Okay, I'm just talking about the one on. I'm not talking about the
cameras in the cars, when the officer drives into the police lot, it's wirelessly uploaded onto a server that's secure.
Right.
So they have, no officer has any contact with any of the video that is recorded in the cars. The taser cameras are pretty much the same way. It would be pretty impossible to alter a video of some kind without it being noticeable, that's for sure.
Excellent. Let's check in with the audience. Respond to this statement. Body cameras, cruiser cameras, etc., will lessen racial profiling in our communities. Okay, cruiser cameras will lessen racial profiling in our communities.
Yeah, I think the jury is still out whether cameras are a good thing, bad thing, neutral thing. In Eric Garner's situation, we got camera, we got video. He's still dead, and the officers were non-indicted. The line that's used that has continued to disturb me is the police officers followed our procedures. When you live in communities and in circumstances and conditions where you feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random acts of violence, and hated or at least despised, or when the guy puffs up and pulls on the belt. I've had it happen in Weathersfield, when the officer said I was changing lanes, I was driving erratically. The CVS on this side was closed. I didn't know it. So I went over to the Walgreens over there. One Saturday night late, 11:30, 12 o'clock, I just left my church preparing for worship service the next day. I mean, it wasn't 2 weeks later, I was pulled again, Weathersfield, going to the grocery store. You're right, sir. We've had vandalisms, and you fit the description. I'm in collar most of the time when I'm driving. But middle age, I'm a little gray now. It's happened so often, so many times, that I don't really, this idea that an officer, blah, 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 there's a system that's wrong. And what I don't hear enough people and enough officers and officials saying, we got a system, we know it's bad, and we're going to work to do something about it. Can you partner with us? Specifically around blah, 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 so that we can change it. It's ridiculous to hear, well, our officers are already, we hear that, we hear that all the time, and it doesn't change.
I agree.
Thoughts, comments, connections, too.
Attorney Moran asked what grade we would give our state or our country, and I would probably say an F, because we're where we were 50 years ago. If you look at the news, you see the same scenes you saw during Selma. So we need to look at this data report as maybe a grading of our individual communities and hold those communities accountable. Like you said, young lady Boulan, if it's one officer that's doing wrong, hold that officer accountable and increase your community. That's the only thing that will diminish racial profiling.
Yeah. And let me say one more thing.
Please.
Let me jump in. I'm not ready to really have conversations towards solutions with officials. We've talked ad nauseum for decades. Quan Solomon, how many of you remember that around here? There were groups met and we had all kinds of committees, because we're famous for that. We're famous for a thing happens, the community has some kind of upheavalment, uprising, some stirring, and then we get groups together. It'd be all kinds of new groups. And we meet. And we declare we've solved the problem, and then we're back here again. 50 years later, we're back again. And so I'm not too quick anymore to be called into a room, and I'm the loudmouth black preacher. So I'm one of those ones that, the Martin King sounded like, not looking like. But the proverbial black preacher that gets the call to be on this group or this committee. And I'm not so willing to do that anymore, because this is status quo. We've done this over and over and over again. What I would like to see is for some truth-telling told by law enforcement. I want some agencies to tell the truth about their own behaviors. You want us as citizens to tell the truth. When we do wrong, and we get called on it. How come we can't get you to say, we're wrong here? We've done some wrong things. We have some officers here, they got to go.
30 seconds.
They got to get fired. We've got to change our system. I'm going to say some more later.
I know you are. Thoughts about what was just offered? Thoughts, connections, too?
Well, I have to take issue with equating Selma with Baltimore.
I didn't equate Selma with Baltimore. I equated what was going on during that period with the riots and things that are going on now. There is a lot of discontent in this country. And maybe that's not your personal experience, but I know people personally who have been racially profiled, who have been subjected to all types of discrimination, whose children have died in the streets today, last week, last month. So I don't mind that you take exception to it.
Well,
That's
then
your right.
if I misheard you, but I thought you equated Baltimore with Selma, which I would take issue with. Because I thought the most impressive thing about Baltimore was when the citizens there lined up as a human shield in front of the cops and protected the cops. I was very impressed with that, because it's a neighborhood.
That's one incident. What happened in
I-
New York? What happened in Ferguson?
There was a group of local people who formed a human shield in front of the cops when they were getting stoned. I saw that happen.
That was a beautiful thing. It
That was
made
a
me
beautiful
cry,
thing.
too.
Those kids.
But that's not the typical thing. That's an anomaly.
Anyone else on that exchange? Anyone else on the panel have thoughts about or feelings connected to?
Yeah, I do. Because yeah, I've been one of those people who have turned my back on police and talked to our babies. And it could be perceived, sir, as I'm protecting the police. But what I'm really doing is you're going to get whammy, baby boy, sister, baby sister. Step back, stand down, so that they don't come with the force that I know and that you know they got. And that's a different perspective than protecting the police. I'm not protecting people who are armored up and weaponed up. I really am turning my attention to the young people and saying, come on, let's stand down, let's live to protest and fight another day.
Oh, you have water? I don't know why you
They were protecting, trying to protect the
Why was they with the neighborhood?
Yeah,
Who was protecting the neighborhood?
trying to quell the property destruction that did not serve that neighborhood at all.
But nothing is serving that neighborhood well at all. That's the problem. Okay.
Destroying property.
Okay. I'll put it in a question and give you a chance.
proud moment for Baltimore.
Okay,
and
because
it's
I've
you.
listened to you. And so I'm going to write it down the question and listen to your answer. Secondly, Weathersfield, I don't understand, sir. What do you mean when you say that people coming from Hartford some kind of way influences racial profiling? Well, what did you say?
The numbers out of that report, that's what that is.
The numbers said that you all had a great disparity.
Right.
You disagree. Why?
Because the numbers are skewed.
How are they skewed?
Because they didn't take into account the people that drive into Weathersfield to shop.
What do you mean by that? Explain that, because I don't know what you mean by that.
They only measured the population and the workforce. So all the people that drive into Weathersfield from the south end of Hartford to shop, because there are no grocery stores or supermarkets in the south end of Hartford, are not counted. So when you measure that, let's just say, we have a population of 9% Hispanic, and we stop 31% Hispanic. If you measured the people that come into Weathersfield to shop, it's probably
More.
a lot more.
But then that makes the disparity larger, not smaller. It would make it a lot more because there's not that many people of color. Excuse me. There's not that many people of color that live in Weathersfield. I say it. There's not that many. And you know this.
Okay, so what's your
Okay,
point?
so then
That's
if you
my
have,
point.
but the
But
point
there's
of
a lot
it
of
is,
people of
if you
color in
have,
the South End.
but let me finish. If you can't hear this, you're here, but you can't face
No,
it.
you're not listening to me.
But you're not listening. I did. I said they were listening, so now I have a question. You
And I
can't
answered
answer
it.
it? No, you don't want it. You don't want to have a conversation with me. You're here to face the neighborhood, but don't want to hear from the neighborhood.
My neighborhood.
Yes, it is. If I'm coming into your neighborhood to shop, I'm the one that's the disparity.
Have you ever been stopped in Weathersfield?
Absolutely.
For no reason?
For no reason.
Have you ever made a complaint to me?
No.
Why not?
Because I would be complaining all of my life. Do you know how much energy that is?
You're saying that you
Every
got stopped
time,
in Weathersfield?
listen, every time black people get stopped and harassed, we can't spend our life complaining about it. We won't be able to
There's nothing I can do about it if you
we
don't complain.
protest.
Okay?
And so, like I said, I don't understand the disparity issue.
I tried to explain it to you, but you
Yes, but that doesn't make sense. If you have a small amount of people of color that live in your neighborhood, yet you have a huge disparity, that means that you are, that what you're doing is extremely bad towards people of color. That's what that amounts to me.
And that's what I tried to explain to you. It's not.
Yeah, and to say people coming from the city would make it better, if you would count the people coming from the city would make it better, that would be not the truth. It would make it worse, because I come from the city. And I'm
What
harassed.
you're saying is not logical.
My husband harassed.
I'm sorry?
My husband harassed. I'm harassed. Yeah. So we are harassed. We live right there.
I want to recognize how important it is that we're able to enter into this dialogue. The difference between a dialogue and a presentation is that we get real people talking to each other about real issues. And while we've heard a lot of point of views on this panel, we want to get an even more diverse representation of our ideas, not only on the subject of racial profiling in Connecticut, but also about implicit bias in our society in general. We want to get more ideas about what are some other systems and institutions within our society that are negatively impacted by that implicit bias. Hopefully, that's kind of where the questions that you all wrote down will go to. If not, I'm going to drive them there, and I just want you to know ahead of time. All right? So I know that Samaya had something to say on that last comment, and then also Steve, and we'll go to the questions.
I just wanted to mention the fact that, you know, I think it's very easy for the police to become a target in this instance, but we have to remember that police are enforcing laws that are on the books. And right now, there are legislators at the state capitol working this session alone to pass hundreds and hundreds of laws, some of them that impact minority communities in awful ways, and we need to be aware of that. The governor has proposed a bill that would repeal laws on the books that currently allow people in what they call school zones, but which are actually end up being urban areas, you know, to have mandatory minimum sentences for something like simple drug possession. That shouldn't be on the books. You should have the same law across the state, and I think those are things that our communities need to be aware of and need to be involved with. And that's happening every day. And I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
I think the only comment I wanted to make, with all due respect to the Reverend, is that I don't think you actually are able to solve problems if you're not in dialogue with people. And I understand as much as I can your frustration with the disparity that exists in the way laws have been enforced. But to me, if you're going to get to solutions, you have to be willing to sit down with the people who are not agreeing with you in order to identify areas of common ground and how to move forward step by step. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin said, with regard to the peace settlements in Israel, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Now, I don't want to consider the police an enemy, but what I do want to say is if you're having problems with behavior on the part of certain police, you have to sit down with the police in order to figure out how to solve those problems. And I agree with you that you have to bring in other groups, and you have to make this a more collaborative and community-wide conversation, and other voices have to be heard. But I don't see how you get to the solution if you just demand of the police that they tell the truth when you're not there sharing your own experience with them so they can learn from what hasn't worked well.
Just like the Department of Justice report came out, there weren't people on the ground meeting with the police. There was a report that was generated that indicted the behavior of and documented a system. I am not saying, I think you misheard me if you heard me to say that I didn't think we needed to come together to fix the problem. I do agree that it is a community problem. But when that is so one-sided, when the onus of dialogue always is from the citizenry, when there is a lack of truth-telling from the systems, we have yet to hear from many systems that we mess up. When I go to the mall, Macy's, and the salesperson acts unseemly toward me, and I complain, I generally get a letter back. We're sorry for your inconvenience, and here's a gift card. We don't get that with police departments and other law enforcement agencies. We don't get the admission of problem. Here's what we've done to fix it, and this will not happen as often as it does happen again. I wish that were the truth, that we could just come together and sit down and fix it. if that were the truth, the race problem would be fixed in America. It's not fixed. And now we see across the world these same issues that Ferguson is everywhere, because the same issues, the same conditions exist. All right, and that's what I am promoting. I'm not suggesting at all that I'm against dialogue. I'm not real quick right now to come rushing in to go to yet another meeting for a period of time. I'm not quick to do that. That's what I was suggesting, because that's how we do it. We rush, meet, get a little thing, have a report, we study it a minute,
30 seconds.
come out with some findings, and then, okay, we fix it. The heat goes down, and we really don't see any measurable and permanent change. I want change.
Thinking about what informs racial profiling, racism, is unintentional bias just as damaging to our communities as intentional discrimination? What are your thoughts? Is unintentional bias or implicit bias just as damaging to our communities as intentional discrimination? Your thoughts? No, it's to the panel.
I would say, you know, in social justice work, we always talk about intent versus impact, right? And that while people may have good intentions, their impact does not always come out the way that they want it to, right? And so I could throw a baseball to Ken and hit him in the face, and while that wasn't my intent, the impact is it probably hurt him, and I should probably apologize, right? And often, especially in higher education, I think we see it a lot with our universities, is that something happens, a fraternity has a party, right? Or someone takes someone back to their room and does something they probably shouldn't do because they've been drinking too much, right? And their intent was, we're having a good time, we're having fun, but the impact is you hurt somebody, emotionally, physically, whatever that may be. And so we need to take responsibility to say, while that was not my intent, I understand that that hurt you. Let's work on how we can move forward and change some of this, right? And so, yes, I think whether it's unconscious or intentional, it still does damage. It still does damage.
I tend to think that implicit bias is more dangerous and more damaging. You can actually respond to somebody who says, I hate you. But somebody who doesn't realize that they have this bias, that I think Boulong talked about earlier very articulately, I think that that is much more difficult to challenge and to meet and to improve upon, because people are often very resistant and immediately go to, I'm not a racist. And then the conversation stops because everybody's on the defensive. I think when you can do effective implicit bias training, you help people step back and appreciate where those deep-seated biases that are societal come from, and then everybody can start to own their own biases and admit that this doesn't make you a bad person. It actually is enlightening and empowering to understand where your biases are so you can actually address them, and then you can start fixing the problem. So I think it's much more dangerous that people don't understand where their biases are as opposed to overt bias, which you see all the time.
I see it
in
every
your
day.
commission. There's still lots and lots of racial bias, gender bias, disability bias cases that come to human rights commissions. They're much easier to deal with when the employer says, I'm not hiring you because you're black. Okay, then you have a case. But when they use pretext and they say, I'm not hiring you because you know, I don't think your experience is as good as this other person's, when their experience is much better, then you start questioning what's the real reason why you're not hiring me.
I think in general, too, people, but I'm going to focus in on white people, need to not be uncomfortable. We're so uncomfortable, right? I mean, and I'll speak as a white person, right? Like, we're uncomfortable talking about race and bias, and because we immediately equate it with, you're calling me a racist or a homophobe or a sexist or a, I think if we can get past that, right, and just maybe start to be comfortable enough accepting other people saying, hey, you know, did you know you said that? Or right, we don't have those conversations, partly because we deny that it exists, and partly because we're uncomfortable. I'll use the example again of the training I was doing yesterday. And I tried to work really hard to create an environment where everybody in that room for 8 hours felt comfortable enough to talk about bias, right? And at some point in the training, I was telling a story about an incident that I was trying to use it to make a point. And a couple of the officers said, you know, when you said this, you know, you were showing this bias, okay? Now, some people, their first reaction might be, well, no, my intent was, and to get in an argument and to go back and forth. I stopped for about 3 seconds. I thought to myself, and I said, good point. Thank you for letting me know that, because now that I think about it, in the brief second I had to process it, you're right. I did reflect some of my bias in the way in which I was retelling that situation. Let's talk about that for a minute. And I'm not comfortable having you give me that criticism, right? And then I tried to just make the point that, like, we all need to be capable of doing that, because we're not perfect.
I see the results of unintentional bias every day. We accept cases in the areas of public accommodation, employment, housing, credit, and now we've even accepted cases in the areas of contract compliance. And without fail, when we file a complaint against a respondent, the first thing they do is say, oh no, we have neutral policies, and these are the policies and they apply to everybody. But what happens is they aren't applied consistently to everybody, and so that's when discrimination occurs. Everybody has neutral policies, and so yes, there are unintended and disparate impacts of unconscious and unintentional bias, and we see it through the prison, the school to prison pipeline. You know, certain kids in certain neighborhoods are disciplined more harshly if they're African American, and they wind up being misdiagnosed or not diagnosed for behavioral or emotional problems that a Caucasian child would be readily identified with early on. And so we do see the unintentional effects of bias.
Here again, we get the conversation, the question gets asked, and it gets reduced into the personal. And I would like to keep conversations as best as we can, especially when we talk about race and bias, in the system arena. There are behaviors that accompany a system. And can we truth tell on these systems that, regardless to what specifics we own up to, these systems are skewed very badly for people who look like me. And every time I'm in a conversation publicly within these kinds of discussions, gets to, I'm not a, well, we really are talking about not only your bad behavior or your right behavior, but the system that is skewed differently. Until America really tells the truth that part of our democracy and our brand of democracy was built on explicit bias toward black people in this country. 3/5 human. We were not even human beings. And that's a truth that very few of us really, really want to own.
John Solders, I'm interested in asking that question to the audience. How would you craft that into a question, or a statement rather, that the audience could agree, don't agree, or block? What would the statement be?
Well, I think he's proposing some systemic changes that'll make a difference. I wrote a book about one of them, which is prison reform. We've advocated in the book that we ought to take our prison population in Connecticut from 16,000 down to 8,000, and we should be treating people and not incarcerating people who are nonviolent drug offenders or are mentally ill. If they're not a threat to public safety, they shouldn't be incarcerated at a cost of $51,000 a year, when they can be treated for anywhere from 10% to a third of that cost, and either cured or set straight, at which point they're not going back through the revolving door and ending up back in prison, but we're returning these people to their families, to their communities. And what we have to do is do all we can to allow them to succeed when they get out of prison, instead of putting up roadblocks. If it was me coming out of prison and I didn't have a way to get a job, I didn't have housing, I didn't qualify for public assistance. I didn't have a place to go or a job. I don't know how I would survive. It's just not good policy. The desired outcome is to restore that person and rehabilitate them and return them to their communities and their families, then we should eliminate all these impediments to their succeeding on the outside. And other states have done this to great effect, and Connecticut is behind the times. The Second Chance Act is a step in the right direction. Addressing your issue about the drug crimes within so many feet of a school is another change that ought to occur. These are systemic changes that are doable. They're actually a problem with a fix, a remedy. There are a lot of problems we have that it's hard to find the remedy. One is the minority academic achievement gap. We throw a lot of money at it, we don't seem to have a solution. This is something that has a solution. We ought to do it. We ought to double down and do this immediately in a big way in Connecticut.
30 seconds.
We'll reduce the cost of our prison system from over $1 billion. We'll save hundreds of millions of dollars, even if we reinvest a portion of that in treatment and rehabilitation. It's something that's being done across the country to great effect in blue states and red states. Why we're not doing it in Connecticut, I'll never understand.
Derek, I'm not avoiding your question.
You're thinking about it.
I just don't know. I think I want to make a compelling argument for, Dr. King said, inseparable twins, racial injustice and economic injustice. It is very clear to me that where we have economic distinctions that are far in this richest state per capita in the country, our cities are some of the poorest cities in the nation, and that we then house in those cities all of the urban ills, these small towns. Hartford is 125,000 plus minus few, and we got it all here. And again, I was making a comment with Sister Yolanda. I hope you don't mind me talking out a little, sidebar. I wasn't so emphatically against or for the stadium being built here in Hartford. What I did take notice is how quick the deal got cut and done. And it's no secret that our schools are abysmal here. We got a few shining lights, and that you quick to lift those up. Achievement first and whatever. But our schools are horrible, and we seemingly can't fix it in 9 months. We got a problem with some of what's happening, whether it's perceived or not. When I talk to Jamal and Pookie and Ray Ray on the street, the po-po is not their friend. I asked my son a little while ago, you remember, my wife and I were talking, what happened to Officer Friendly? You remember him? Those of us of a certain age remember Officer Friendly coming to visit us. My children don't know who Officer Friendly. My son said, who? And he's a sophomore in college. Who is Officer Friendly? Is that a dude? So I think we got work to do. And again, your solutions, Mr. Bryant, Brother Bryant, I didn't need to go to a meeting to fix that. I didn't need to come around and have community debates and discussions.
30 seconds.
There is some analysis. Let's get to work. Let's put some people, let's vote them in or get them in that will really attack what we need to do. Just like the stadium got built real quick, I applaud the mayor for it. I want the schools to get fixed just like that.
Audience check-in. The current experience of racial profiling is a symptom and direct result of our history and current systems of racialized oppression of people of color.
I might want to repeat that again.
I'll say it again. The current experience of racial profiling is a symptom and direct result of our history and current systems of racialized oppression of people of color. Panelists, thoughts, reflections, connections to, disagreements with our audience.
You're throwing them softballs. I don't know that, you know, I don't know that anybody here would disagree that, you know, the idea of racial profiling isn't just a, you know, part of the sins of our past, right? I mean, that's really what it is. I don't know where I heard it, but I heard it, remember when I was young, you know, slavery was America's greatest sin, and it's still haunting us.
Sure.
My question is, what do you do when the police, there's a case where there's a shooting or there's an accident, and the police do not release the video as quickly as they usually do, or when you petition with the Freedom of Information Act, you do all of these steps to get the video, and yet you don't get it, especially when the case is questionable, and you don't get it till, you might not ever get it, or you don't get it to the last second, or by the time you do get it, the video's been edited. So how do you really police that? You can't, you really have no control over that. So what we have to understand that is very subtle. That's the thing with racism, it's extremely subtle. So we have to pay attention to those small nuances. But what do you do when they don't release the video, or there's all kinds of diversionary things that happen? How do you stop that?
What I would say is, I'll let law enforcement answer, I don't understand the protocol behind releasing the video. What I tend to find more troubling is not the release of the video, but it's the, coming out before any facts are known and saying, well, did you guys know Freddie Gray was arrested 18 times?
Right.
They're very quick to tell you that. I'm just making a comment. I don't have
Anyone in law enforcement want to take a crack at it?
I'm going to take this in a larger way, because we submit FOIA requests all the time at the ACLU, and I think that it depends on the police department. Some police departments respond quickly and completely, but many police departments do not, and in fact delay and obfuscate and wait until either the last minute or until after the information is no longer useful, and then all of a sudden we get a flood of information. So I'm not directing that at any particular police chief or department. I don't want to be perceived as antagonistic, but I do think it's really important for police chiefs to understand that if they're going to be seen as cooperative and as honest and authentic in their policing, they have to be willing to follow the law and release the information that is FOIA'd. They have the opportunity to have exceptions. They have the opportunity to redact confidential information, but to delay and delay doesn't actually help the image of the police to look as if they're trying to cooperate with law enforcement. So it's just a general statement, but from experience at the ACLU at least.
I can answer that, maybe, but we just follow the law. Whatever the Freedom of Information requires, whatever you have to notify in so many days, you have to produce in so much time, and if by some chance we didn't, then you would be taken before the Freedom of Information Commission. And if you're wrong, you're fined. And I can tell you that we've never been fined in Wethersfield, so we've never not complied with the law. I don't know, are you speaking from experience, or are you talking generally?
I'm speaking from, basically what I experienced, what I see in the news.
You asked for a video and you didn't get it?
Let me respond, please. Just like the case that just happened in California, where a homeless man was shot, and they won't release the video of what happened. So now it's, and the case is suspicious. So then the police chief came out and said that he was suspicious. Just like you said, it skews the case when the police chief says that the case is suspicious before the video comes out. So now he kind of messed up the case a little bit. So it's this whole quagmire around the whole case, but yet and still they don't want to release the video with the Freedom of Information Act and with all of these things that they're trying to do to make them release the video. They won't release it. So what do you do there? That right there is supremacy or control. That's how it's done. When you want the information, you can't get it. But when they want to release it, they will. But when they don't want to release it, what do? Nothing. You sit there and you don't get the information, and then
Any thoughts on that? Okay. One of the questions, because I want to get to the questions that folks wrote down, was do you think, so panel, do you think that there is racial bias that exists in the plea bargaining process within our court system?
Let me just speak from quick experience, okay? I know we want to talk systematic, but I'm going to talk experience again because it's what I like to do. I have a very close relative who was arrested, and because he had family that had the financial means, this is my own experience, right, to hire him a good lawyer, cost a lot of money. The lawyer knew the system. The lawyer knew how the plea bargaining system worked. He was able to work the system so that this relative still had to do some jail time, but I would say he was brought up on about 5 felony charges. They were all dropped to misdemeanors, served a couple months in prison, probably would have served years had he took an earlier plea. I don't know how much of that has to do with the fact that he was white and privileged.
Other thoughts and connections too?
I think it's, whoever asked that question, I think it's also a little difficult for other people to chime in because nobody here is a prosecutor, and those would really be the people that are probably really better equipped to answer questions like that.
Okay. Another question that folks wrote down was for the police chiefs. Do you believe that you and your officers have bias?
I came right out in the front and said, I'd hope not. I suspect so, and you have to address it. If it's an issue with my public who I serve, we have to do something about it. So that's about as clear as I can be. We have to detect it. We have a 1%, just like everybody else has a 1%, that we constantly adjust, attend to, discipline, and sometimes fire. And that's my job as a police chief. I walk that very narrow line between my citizens and my officers.
Chief Citrin?
You said it very well. It's the same thing. I've terminated officers that have made mistakes and done things wrong, and I will continue into the future if they do something wrong, but I'll back them if they do it right and are accused falsely. It is a tough line to walk. I'm not clairvoyant, but I think I have a pretty good feel after the many years that I've been doing this as to who is doing it right and who isn't. I mean, I just have one question. I know I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth on this one. Ken, do you think it would have made a difference, whatever, any race, the person with the money is going to get the good lawyer and probably get the better deal? I don't think the race had anything to do with that.
So let me.
We have cards. We have cards.
So I had a scenario again yesterday in that training, right, where we talk about, right, A plus B equals C. Typically in this country, right, at least in the state of Connecticut, right, white people tend to have greater access to higher levels of wealth, right? Black and Hispanic individuals, particularly people that live in urban environments, are of a lower income status, right? And right, so I think to your point, if there was a white individual who didn't have money, right, and couldn't afford the lawyer, yeah, they would probably end up having to take one of the first deals that came along. But at least in this state, the wealth gap, right, the disparity between white, black, and Hispanic individuals is very big, right? I mean, you've got Greenwich here and Bridgeport here, all in the same county. I mean, Connecticut's really unique in that way. But yeah, I get your point, Chief.
Well,
So,
just, go ahead.
There's been a lot of male voices, so I'm gonna hop in here. So, one, I want to respond to the police, our bias question, whatever. Like I said before, we are all indoctrinated in this system. We all have biases, right? And so we need to operate from this framework that we are all imperfect human beings and we're all gonna make mistakes, right? I think if we can accept that as fact, and no matter what job we are doing, that will make us better human beings, right? That will make us better people. It's about checking those biases, right? And being able to acknowledge when they show up, especially in fields and workplaces where you are supposed to be helping and protecting and serving other populations of people who are very diverse and you have control, right? I'm an educated person, right? I have multiple degrees, and so I have a bias about people who may not have a college education, and I'm aware of that, right? I acknowledge that. I know that because I grew up from a very privileged background in terms of my education, right? And so if we can all accept these facts as truth, as a part of who we are, the other thing, to go back to that question about it not being about race, it may not have just been about race, right? We have intersecting identities. I am not just a black person, I am a black woman. I am a black woman from New England. I am a black educated woman from New England, right? I have all of these identities that impact the way in which I interact with the world and the way the world interacts with me. So this person maybe having money impacted that decision, as well as them maybe being white, as well as maybe they were male, as well as maybe they knew someone who worked in law, right? Like, we have all of these different things. It's complex. This is not an easy conversation, and it's not an easy system to talk about, right? So we have to kind of push beyond this one-dimensional view of things, right? It's complex. Identities are complex. Human beings are complex, right? And so we need to move beyond just this one-dimensional conversation, because we're not going to go anywhere doing that.
Audience check-in. Race and class are separate issues in America. Race and class are separate issues in America. Why can't white people be called racist? Why do we spend time protecting white people from being known as racists? We say they are unintentionally biased. Thoughts about connections to, conflict with?
I don't want to chime in again, but I will.
Do it.
I'm the educator on the panel.
Please.
So I think when we talk about racism, we really need to talk about systemic racism, right? We really need to talk about how racism operates as a big umbrella system. And so, yes, do people have behaviors that can be classified as racist? White people specifically, right? When we talk about racism systemically, we talk about people who have power in that system. And right now, that is white people, right? Same thing we could talk about men. Same thing we could talk about people who identify as heterosexual, right? They have power in this system. And so to be racist systemically is to be white, right? That does not mean that brown people and black people cannot be prejudiced, discriminate against folks, be hateful, be mean, right? We can be all of those things. But racism and to be racist really coincides with having power within the system and being able to alter a system or enact the system on bodies that are different from yours, right? And so that requires systemic power. So I really want to talk about that at a greater level, right? That we can all be prejudiced and discriminate against folks, but to be racist and to be enacting a racist system coincides with having power within that.
I agree, and I'd like to take it one step further. If the question was, why can't white people be called racists? I just don't think it's productive to call people names that are going to alienate them and make them defensive. So it seems to me that you're much better off in having a productive dialogue if you stay away from naming people and try to talk about behaviors and try to figure out where they're coming from and how to change that so that people are, as Boulang said, more self-aware and then can address these things. But most people, when called names, shut down and just stop listening. And so then there's no dialogue. So if that's helpful.
Sure.
But it's acceptable to call young people who are protesting thugs and hoodlums. And that's kind of benign. We say that, and then I'm not disagreeing, I'm just adding some more to it. Let's get clear.
I don't think that's helpful either.
Well, yeah, but it's not helpful for me to have you say it's not helpful when to name call. When name calling is a part of our culture. It's in our culture, and let's be clear. The analogy, if you want to talk, let's talk and let's come from our spaces to get a common assessment and analysis of what's going on.
I'm
it's
not
helpful.
disagreeing with that.
Well, yeah, what I heard is what we always hear. It's not helpful to name call. But the president of these United States called those young people in Baltimore thugs. And I was appalled at the use of the language. Because what I saw were freedom fighters who were tired and sick and tired of being sick and tired, and who erupted in an emotional way to what has been systematically laid on top of them. I saw young people, I saw high schoolers and teenagers. I didn't see thugs.
Reverend, can I ask you whether you condone the property damage in Baltimore that was done by those?
This is always where it goes, right?
No, I'm just asking.
This is always where it goes. So
I just want to, it's a simple question.
Yeah, it's not a simple question, but I will answer it simply, all right?
You can answer.
I don't equate property damage, all right, and vandalism to violence against a person. And I hear it time and time again. Violence in your community. Why did they get?
What about the guy who owns the mom and pop grocery store that's burned down? He doesn't have enough
You asked me the
insurance
question, right?
to
You asked me the
rebuild.
Let's let him answer.
Is that a crime against a person?
I
or
didn't
not?
ask him a question. He asked me.
No. Brian or Mr. Moran, let's let him fully answer the question. So the question being, that's okay. So the question being, is it violent? What do you think about the violence in the community?
It goes here all the time. These are classic pat answers, and
Are broken spines the same thing as broken windows?
Yeah. I'm here to say, can we have a honest discourse and dialogue instead of the kind of pat answers? All right, that's what I'm here to do, and I'm going to raise it. And I do not make any apologies for being obstinate and passionate as I raise them. We say this junk all the time, and it gets uninterrogated, and it flies through, and we walk out of here, and all the black people and people of color be talking on their breath. Well, that was the same old conversation we had. The last year we had that same old conversation. 15 years ago, back in the day, we had these same conversations. And so we have the opportunity with some documentation to push this conversation further along, all right? Do I condone property damage? No, I own some property. I don't want nobody coming on my property and damaging it, all right? Do I understand what happened? You doggone Skippy. And I felt like for about 15 minutes to throw a brick myself. And I would dare say most of us, when we have had things happen to us over and over and over again, don't have a visceral reaction. I'm also 52 years old, mature, and own property, and I said, I can't throw that brick.
We want to thank our panelists. We can give them a round of applause. In closing, if you have questions, raise your hand. If you still have questions. These dialogues are the beginning of a journey and not the end. We would be here for a lot of hours if we really wanted to find a solution to each and every problem. We don't have that time here today in this space, but what you do have is right now in this moment access to some folks who have some real power here. Now, I don't know what their schedules look like, but I would encourage you to, if there's a question that's burning in your mind and you want to ask it to one of these individuals, okay, walk up to them, talk to them in this space in a respectful and civil way, and then honestly open your ears to what their answers are, and if those answers aren't good enough, find another pathway, find another way to get what you need and to get what your community needs. I want you all to give them a round of applause one more time. we want to do our thank yous.